Hi, I'm Su Jamison, and my background is working in architectural firms for most of my life as an interior designer. So spaces and buildings are very important. And when I moved to Castlemaine, I became a guide at the Castlemaine Art Gallery. And we would research local Australian artists. And I found that in all these wonderful biographies, they would talk about the buildings and the houses that they lived in. And it was really an important part of their lives. They actually met in these spaces. It didn't matter what background they had, whether they were poor or wealthy, they still gathered together at these meeting spaces. And Percy Leason is actually a very important person at Castlemaine as well, because the previous director, Peter Perry, managed to bring him to light in Australia, and he also managed to get a lot of the works through to other galleries as well. So I'm actually putting together a book called EASELS Edifices, because a lot of these spaces are, there's a common thread. There are mentors that become friends, there are artist camps, there are restaurants, cafes, where they went to school at the National Gallery School. When we look at Percy Leason and his bricks and mortar story, he grew up in a house in Kaniva in 40 Progress Street, and it was a typical timber home with a large, wide veranda at the front and corrugated iron roof and a picket fence at the front. And I've also been informed that they used the second house as well for the family that was next door. But Percy, he always had a desire to have a studio, and that's something that we can see across his life. So at a very young age, when he decided that he wanted to be an artist, he actually pulled together some pieces, bits and pieces. He had a piano carcass, he had found certain bits of timber, and he'd also flattened out kerosene tins and created this studio in the backyard of his parents' home. And we see that in his life, that where the family that he loves is bustling and busy in the main house, he always sought the solitude of his studio so that he could focus on his painting, his anthropology, his black and white drawings. And this studio, this first studio, is actually very significant because this is where he drew his first cartoons that he sent to the Melbourne Weekly, where it was published. And he also sent them to Sands and McDougall, where he got his apprenticeship. And that's what takes him in 1906 to Melbourne as a young lad, but full of enthusiasm, into Melbourne. And he originally stayed with an uncle who was a little bit too conservative for Percy. So Percy then sought out boarding house to stay in. Now, boarding houses in those days were very, very acceptable and reputable, and it was very much like a cheap hotel, or it could have been an older house that a person, like a woman, generally ran, where they would rent out the bedrooms and they would have the common dining room and the common lounge room, and you would share the bathroom. So he stayed in a couple of boarding houses in West Melbourne and East Melbourne during the time that he was working at Sands and McDougall. But he also made really good friends with Richard McCann, who was at Sands and McDougall. And they sought out some cheap studios. Now, Melbourne at the time, there were a lot of spaces that were available that were not glamorous. They were warehouses that had been left empty because industry had moved to the outer suburbs of the city. And there were offices, these large buildings, beautiful old buildings that had lots of different offices in them that a huge number of artists then took on as their own studios. And they would have evenings where they would showcase their work. And it gave them a credibility that meant that they could actually have commissions. People were interested in artists that had a studio. The downside is there was quite often no water, and you would actually have to go to an outhouse where the night soil man still came to collect in the evening. So you didn't have the luxuries of a flushing toilet and a kitchenette. So you very much plugged in your kettle and actually boiled up tea, even on a small burner, because they very much lived off tea and toast, and quite often black tea. And this Percy was very comfortable with this. This is a boy that came from the country. And it would also mean that they would go off into the country. Eltham was considered quite rural at the time. It was the end of the train line. And there's a delightful story where his good friend Jock Frater and he were camping out on a winter's night. They would build a large fire, and during the evening, as the fire died down, they would brush the ashes aside, and they would sleep on that warm patch. Now this is Percy in his shambolic suit and his trademark hat, and they would just brush themselves off and have a good laugh the next morning. They would also have the opportunity to stay at some other artists' houses out there at the time, like Walter Withers, because his good friend Richard McCann, that went on these painting trips, ended up marrying Walter Withers' daughter, Marjorie. They were of the same era, and they were both artists with the same sense of humour and their same approach. Also, they would meet up. The city had their support network at that time with artists as well too. And there were a lot of cafes opening up which offered really cheap meals that would have a free glass of wine with them. You could actually have a meal. There was Pulitzer's in Collins Street, where he agreed with artists that if they gave him some work, an art piece, that he would give them a meal. And Percy had several of his pieces up on the wall shown, which was really exciting for Percy, but it also meant he was fed, because money was always an issue. But a lot of these cafes understood that, and they would let them stay there for the evening, where they would end up singing and talking loudly. Another restaurant was Fazoli's in Lonsdale Street, and that was another very popular place with artists, where he would, the owner would actually make large pots of pasta, even ossobuco at the time, which was very exotic, and it would only cost a shilling and a sixpence, and they could eat well and have a good feed and enjoy each other's company, which was terrific. And quite often art was about politics as well. They were quite often very concerned about what was happening around at the time as well. So Percy ended up marrying Belle Leason, who he adored, and they first rented a flat or a unit in Hawthorn, and Belle became pregnant not long after the wedding. Now, flats at the time, again, we're talking about 1916. This was during the war. A lot more flats and units were starting to be available and were being built, and Hawthorn was still quite close to the city, so he would even walk there, if not take the tram or the train into the city to his studio. So units were also, a lot of women were coming back into the workforce, and a lot of men had gone off to the war, and a lot of refugees were coming in as well from Europe. So there was a great need for housing that wasn't expensive. Now, during this time, Percy got a great reputation with the various newspapers in both Sydney and Melbourne, and he was offered a very lucrative job in Sydney. Once Belle had Jack, she went up to Sydney, and they actually bought a place. He was doing so well with his black and white work in Sydney that he bought this lovely bungalow, I would say, at the time. It looks like a bungalow in Byron Avenue on a headland, and things were going very well for them as a family. The unfortunate thing was that Percy was feeling a little restless. I anticipate that he was feeling that, yes, I can do the black and white work, but I've always wanted to paint and do something else. And by this stage, they had 3 children, and he was lured back to Melbourne to work on one of the major papers there and the magazines. And he was doing a lot of illustrative work for book covers as well too. So he was actually very, very successful and very popular. So they actually sold up, did this amazing trip back to Melbourne in his converted car that became a caravan. He was very inventive. And when they came back to Melbourne, they realised that they missed the bush. So they both decided that they would move to Eltham because it was still a part of the landscape that they loved. And he could paint there and they could raise the family. So by this stage they had 4 children, and they moved into Lavender Road, which is now Lavender Road, to this lovely house. Not long after, it would have been about 1925, that he built a studio. Now in those days you didn't need a building permit as such or a planning permit, and I don't think that would have made a huge difference to Percy and many artists at the time also. But he had a builder, a very good builder, and he knew that he could salvage goods from various places, which was exciting. He even had a door with a glass front with cafe written on the front, and he utilised all that. And in the design, he knew that as an artist, he needed south light, so he had the right lighting that wouldn't provide any shadows onto the artwork. And he could actually fit a large desk that he'd managed to find and purchase quite cheaply with a slight angle on it so that he could actually read his books. He could play his music comfortably, and he could have lots of friends around for discussions, and they did come from Melbourne. They would arrive on the train, they would stay up quite late. If they missed the last train, they would just bunk down into the studio, and Belle was, mind you, all this time not only looking after the family but providing refreshments for them as well, and a cheap meal. So this was a very happy space for Percy and the family. And a friend, another tonalist called Justice Jurgensen, he started Montsalvat, which most of us have heard of, and it was very much made without much planning. It was just very much made as a community of artists and friends and writers, and a lot of found pieces from Whelan's The Wrecker would quite often offer materials. I think there was a large entranceway and window that was given to Jorgensen at the time, which made the Grand Hall. So it was actually quite an interesting building project that was happening over the road. At the same time, there was also a very bohemian influence and lifestyle happening as well too, where they were very much of the time where they were quite happy to have an open relationship, and a lot of the young artists of the time, including Percy and Belle's children, were rather taken by this and quite flattered and quite attracted to a number of the younger artists over there as well. So Percy and Belle started to see this happen, and they elected, for various other reasons also. Things weren't going as well for Percy's artwork. Almost like a sense of him not being appreciated and not selling as much as he could. There was a war on, so people weren't spending money on artwork, and he actually felt that a lot of what he was working on, his anthropology, his science of tonalism, wasn't being listened to as well and appreciated. So they did end up moving to New York, Staten Island, and one of the houses that they lived in there in St Paul's Avenue it was rented. It was a large, rambling arts and crafts house. It was beautiful, lots of lovely stained glass, views over the water, and I understand that they were incredibly happy there. But this is where he could start up lessons. He had studios. He was incredibly busy and was very appreciated in New York for his work. So he had a whole new audience. Now, I might say too that if we're talking of public buildings that Percy was involved in, he did study at the National Gallery of Victoria at the time, the School of Art. That was actually in the State Library, and you would enter by the Russell Street entrance. This was actually a place where a huge number of very successful artists got their education. You did 3 years of drawing, where you just drew plaster casts, a very conservative type of lessons, and then you would have a year of painting. And he had Fred McCubbin was his teacher for drawing. Fred McCubbin was incredibly well liked, which was great. He would also invite Percy Leason and some of the other students back to his house in South Yarra, which was just overlooking the Yarra, and it was behind Como House. So it was close to town as well, and a very happy place to be. The other place he was involved in was the Victorian Art Society, and that was just on the edge of the Melbourne city in East Melbourne, and it was very supportive of artists. You could exhibit, you could actually teach, meet, and it was actually a wonderful group for artists, a place for artists to actually congregate. And he would exhibit at the Athenaeum in Melbourne as well too. So there's lots of wonderful spaces that he was a part of, and he leaves a really good legacy as well, because his paintings are reminiscent of that time. He painted his studios, he painted interiors, so we can see with his self-portraits that, you know, the background and what was in his house at the time. So Percy Leason is extraordinary and has left a wonderful legacy.